Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the previous lecture, we saw how social sciences were constructed in the early 20th century on the basis of a misunderstanding of the nature of knowledge. In this lecture, we will show how we can fix that problem and construct Islamic economics on the basis of new natural foundations for humanities. As a brief recap of the previous lecture, which was based entirely on Julie Reuben, Making of the Modern University, she writes that social sciences in their modern form took shape in the early 20th century on the basis of the philosophy of logical positivism, which divided knowledge into two kinds of knowledge. One was scientific knowledge, which was valid and objective and respectable, and the other kind of knowledge, which was human, subjective, based on the heart, and just unreliable and not valid as knowledge. And this led to a radical transformation in the education system itself, which started to focus on knowledge of external reality and completely neglected knowledge of our own selves, our inner human being, our morality, our ethical, spiritual dimensions. So the social sciences in the early 20th century were constructed on the basis of a double mistake. The first mistake was a misunderstanding of the methodology of physical sciences. Logical positivism actually doesn't understand correctly what the physical sciences are. But then this misunderstanding of the methodology was applied to construct the social sciences as a scientific way to approach humanities. So both of these are big mistakes, which has resulted in a dramatically wrong foundation for modern economics. So to give a little bit more detail, logical positivism basically says that science is based only on observables. And this is wrong, because science also deals with gravity and electrons and quarks and quasars and many other things which are not observable. But the idea was to differentiate it from religion and to say that religion is based on unobservables and science is based on observables. In fact, the foundation of this philosophy of science is the rejection of the unseen. Notice the dramatic contrast with the Quran, which starts by defining the believers as those who believe in the unseen. So the methodology currently in use for social sciences is directly in violation of what the Quran requires of the believers. And that's why it is essential for us to construct a new methodology. So the second mistake was the idea that scientific methodology can or should be applied to study of humanities. There are many differences between studying physical objects subject to laws and studying human beings who are free. Many different problems arise from applying science to humanities, which are all mistakes that are embodied in the current subject matter of economics. So for example, subjective human experience, the feelings in our hearts are not part of scientific knowledge. So social science is built on an external analysis, looking at human beings from the outside and thinking of them as robots subject to mechanical laws. And societies themselves then become subject to mathematical laws like those of physics. And this is a mistake, double mistake. Human beings are no longer agents of change. They cannot change things, they cannot think, they cannot act. And the second mistake is that if you think of universal laws, then you can't take into account specific events like World War I, which was a one-time event. So that's not, there's no universal law which will explain what happens, how the World War I happened and how the World War II happened. But these two are essential to understanding our economic situation today. So it's essential to develop a new methodology. Instead of taking a neutral, detached, value-free study of physical objects, we need to, when we study society, we need to be engaged, we need to be passionate, we need to be committed, we need to try to work and identify injustice and remove it, and to improve the lives of human beings and to feel strongly about these things. So there's a natural three-dimensional methodology which is suited for development of Islamic economics, which I will describe in this lecture. And it's based on heart, head, and hands. So there's the positive aspect, which is actually the modern economics basis, which describes existing social conditions. So this, we use our head to look at the world and to understand it. But then there is the normative component. We imagine the ideal situation and our heart guides us towards this ideal. And then there's the transformative. Take action to change the injustice, to remove poverty, to help the poor, and to move towards the ideal. So head, heart, hands, all three are involved in an Islamic social science. So we briefly consider all three dimensions separately. We start with the heart, which is the most important. Islamic teachings place great emphasis on the heart, and the heart is actually the driver of human actions. Placing the heart at the center makes it very different from conventional economics, because it says that we follow our desires, and we are not, when we make decisions about consumption, for example, we may not be constrained by our budget. Rather, if we want something, then we will create the income required to purchase that thing. So we do not calculate which object will maximize our utility. We look at the things that we want, and then decisions are based on desires. And the pedagogical consequences are that students will understand this theory because it matches with our human experience. Unlike economics, when students encounter utility theory, they think of it as very strange and alien, because nobody actually makes these calculations which everyone is supposed to do. In business school, they understand this very clearly. There are books called Consumer Theory in Business School, which are radically different from the same title book, Consumer Theory in Economics, because business school understands that people make decisions with their hearts. And one evidence for this is a survey which showed that consumers in Australia purchased $10 billion worth of goods, which they never unpacked. So the decision was made because they were attracted to the good, but when they took it home, then they realized that it's really not of much use. So advertising in business school appeals to the heart, not the head, and it corrupts the heart by creating in it love of material possessions. The Quran teaches us that verily your efforts are diverse. Different people are driven by different motives. So if you want to understand how the world works, if you want to understand how human beings behave, we have to figure out what they are driven by. And we can start by realizing that very few people are driven by a rational calculation to maximize utility. Different people have different goals. So coming to the second dimension of description, we have to look at actual behavior of human beings, not axiomatic behavior. And we have to study actual economics, actual economic institutions. And this depends on history, context, and varies by time, place, culture. Economics between the two world wars was different from pre-World War economics, because pre-World War I gold standard obtained, and post-World War I there wasn't enough gold for the gold standard. And after World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement came into place. So all of these things are part of description. We have to actually look at the real world. We can't sit in books and write formulas and expect to learn to describe what's happening. So going forward, we need to look at actual behavior of human beings. We need to look at how financial institutions actually work. We need to look at how the global economic system works. And all of these are subject matters within economics. We have to study how economic systems and human behavior has all evolved across time and how it varies with societies. And all of this study will be created by a desire to create improvements, to analyze the weaknesses and the problems, and to find ways to remove them. So it is not neutral, detached, and impartial study. Just one simple example of behavioral economics. There is a lot of study of something called the Ultimatum game, or the Dictator game, in which people are asked to share an amount of money between two or more people. And the key finding is that people do not maximize their own share, except for economists. Economists are trained with the wrong theory, and when they come into this game, they sometimes maximize their own share instead of doing what most human beings do. So what do most human beings do? They actually are driven by multiple motivations. Some of them divide the money equally because they're driven by justice, fairness, equity. Others actually are driven by sympathy, consideration for others. And still others are driven by the fear that if other people think badly about me, if I will just be greedy. And so they act fairly even though they don't feel fair. So The point is that there is a very complex constellation of motives which drives economic behavior, and it's not a simple profit maximization or utility maximization as economists think. One consequence of looking at actual behavior is that we find that people are often driven by process and by duty and by trust and by sense of responsibility, not by outcomes. So the standard economic model says that people only concerned by outcomes if they can get the most, but most people are not are concerned by the process by which they get things. So if they can find a halal and legal way to get a large amount, they might do it, but they are also concerned with making sure that their actions are actually the process by which they earn, the process by which they spend are fair and reasonable. One of the central realizations we come to when we look at actual human behavior is that human beings are free to choose. They are not subject to mathematical rules. They can change and they can make decisions which are good or bad. And so this is actually very much in consonance with Islam, that we are a mixture. We are, on the other hand, our nafs is commanding us to be evil. On the other hand, our ruh is filled with the conception of good, and it attempts to drive us to the good. So the human heart is actually a battleground between good and evil, and this is a much more complex description of human reality than what economic theory tells us. So coming to the third dimension, Islamic economics asks us to make positive change. So how can we transform the world to move from the current description towards the normative ideals? Islam offers us a three-dimensional transformation strategy. One is at the individual level, which requires purification of the heart. The other is at the institutional level. We build cooperative institutions instead of competitive institutions. And the third is the dimension of regulation. And this is the Sharia, which asks for justice and equity. So at the individual level, the strategy is the purification of the heart. And Allah Ta'ala tells us that we have shown him the two highways of good and evil. People are born into Islam means that the heart is built with the capacity to recognize good and evil in its pure form. But our training can actually blacken the heart, and it can create bad desires in the heart. So purification is required to cleanse the evil influences of advertising, which appeals to material and base instincts and brings them out and makes them strong and corrupts our heart. At the institutional level, Islamic institutions are built on the idea of creating cooperation, love, harmony, sympathy, and coordination, as opposed to capitalist institutions which are adversarial. So the interest transaction, I want to take your money and I want to make a profit, even if you are poor and if you are in need, and I will, if you can't pay me the interest, I will possess your house. As opposed to this, Musharaka says that we are partners in this house, and if the house gains, we will both gain, and if the house loses, then we will both lose. And this is a cooperative transaction. Similarly, takaful means taking care of each other in times of need, but insurance means taking advantage of each other. So if in an insurance transaction is an adversarial transaction, where if the somebody loses their house, then the insurance company tries to minimize its payment and the owner of the house tries to maximize the payment. Similarly, firms are oriented towards service of the people instead of profit maximization. So all of these things are ways in which the institutional structure of Islam is built to create cooperation instead of creating competition and adversarial partnerships. The third dimension of transformation is regulatory, which is based on the Sharia and the law, which is based on a cooperative search for justice, instead of each one trying to win the case regardless of whether their party is just or unjust. So they use power to try to get their goals without regard for justice. Instead, Islam says that power should be used to help the oppressed, not to oppress, and to make justice easily available to the weak. And it says that there is a right of the poor in the wealth of the rich. So all of these lead to actual regulations and institutions which implement these idealistic ideas. So we can summarize in some concluding remarks. There's a new methodology required for third generation Islamic economics, and this is a three-dimensional methodology which involves both the heart and the head and the hands. The normative dimension is an ideal Islamic society, but we also understand that human beings are driven with diverse goals, so we don't impose Islam on everybody. Rather, it's a realistic methodology. We look at the world around us, we'll see what people are doing, and we try to make small changes to move towards the ideal, not necessarily achieve the ideal, because the goals are not in our hands, but the process is in our hands. So the transformative strategies take into account different classes of people, the balance of power, what can actually be done, what cannot be done. So we don't try for over-ambitious goals if they cannot be achieved. We use strategies of persuasion, discourse, and we try to implement Islamic ideals by creating models which are themselves ways of attracting people.